Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 122. And today I'm going to talk about the 1982 album by Yazoo, or Yaz, depending on whether you're in the UK or North America, Upstairs at Eric's. It was released on Mute Records in the UK and Sire Records in North America, and this is the first Canadian release. This is a fascinating album, and it's also an historically important album. In a lot of ways, it's an emo album before its time. It's very much concerned with heartbreak, remorse, introspection. If the songs aren't all minor key songs, the overall impression of this album is very much a minor key, melancholy kind of impression. The combination of artists is also very interesting too. The music on here is all synthesizers. And at the time, the late 70s and the early 1980s, that kind of music was heavily influenced by Kraftwerk. People were seeking a kind of a robotic sound, not just in the music, but in the vocals. That was the aesthetic they were aspiring to. That's not at all what you get here. You do get computery, synthy music, but you also have this powerful blues singing. If anything, Alison Moyes sounds a lot like Aretha Franklin, which was not a combination that you had really in any other kind of band at the time. Yazoo are comprised of Vince Clarke and Alison Moyes, and both Vince and Alison are from Basildon. If you know much about the UK, you have to say that Basildon is not the most memorable town in Essex, and arguably Essex is not the most memorable county in the UK, but Basildon has a serious claim to fame as the birthplace of three of the most significant synth-pop groups of the 1980s, Depeche Mode, Erasure, and Yazoo. Alison Moyes had grown up in the town, and as a teenager in the 1970s, she'd been heavily influenced by the emergence of punk. By her own account, she became a singer by default because the bands she was in were punk bands. It was still in the late 70s a bit risque to be in a punk band in the more provincial towns in England. And she had the size and the aggressiveness and just the attitude to be able to be the lightning rod for the band while everybody else kind of cowered behind. By the early 80s, punk in the UK had basically shot its bolt. It had certainly shot its bolt for more marginal punk bands in small towns. And Moyes' attention had actually turned to singing R&B. And she puts an ad in the Melody Maker in 1981 looking for other musicians to form what she called a rootsy blues band. She only got one reply, and that reply was from Vince Clarke, who remembered her name from school. Clarke himself, of course, had been a member of Depeche Mode. He was a key part of their first album. He'd written a song called Only You, and he needed a singer to be able to make a demo. He invites her over, and she completely nails the vocal on the first take. Clarke takes the demo to Mute Records. He plays it for the label boss, a guy called Daniel Miller, who actually doesn't really like the song, which is amazing to me because I think that song is just incredible. But when it gets played later that day for some other people at the label, they're completely enthusiastic and say, "You've got to sign these guys." So at this point, Clarke phones up Moyes, who, recall, had just gone to record this demo tape and hadn't thought much more of it, and basically told her, "We've got a record deal." They also needed a name for the band. Moyes, who had been listening to a whole bunch of R&B, suggested Yazoo, which was the name of an old label that used to put out blues records, which actually ended up giving them some headaches because not only did the old label realize that they were calling themselves Yazoo and Sue, but also their American distributor told them when it was time to release a single in the United States, there was an American band called Yazoo. So they became, on this side of the Atlantic, Yaz. From their early recordings, they encounter what can only be described as instant success. Only You goes to number 2 in the UK. Don't Go goes to number 3. They had to write something quickly for the B-side to Only You, and what they came up with is the song which I actually think is their single best song of all time, which is Situation. As a B-side, Situation becomes a big club hit in North America, it gets remixed by a bunch of folks, and ends up getting released as a single in its own right a little bit later on in 1982. Clarke's suggestion was that they try and book the only studio he actually knew about, which was Blackwing Studio, where he had recorded the album Speak and Spell with Depeche Mode. The deal they'd made with Daniel Miller, the label boss, was that he was going to produce the record, but when they got to Blackwing Studios, he was otherwise occupied. On top of that, another group, Fad Gadget, had already booked the studio time to record their own album. The owner of the studio was a guy called Eric Radcliffe, and he said to Moyes and Clarke, "Look, if you want to record here, you can do so. You can use the time between 4 a.m. and 11 a.m. when no one else wants to use the studio." And so that's what they decided to do, with Radcliffe and Clarke basically co-producing the record. And the name of the album, Upstairs at Eric's, refers to the fact that they were so grateful for all the things which Radcliffe did in helping the album come to be. Going into the session, Clarke had only previously been involved in one recording session for Speak and Spell. Moyes had never been involved in a recording session other than her demo sessions. And according to both musicians, that naivete about the recording process led to a very minimalist kind of approach to the music which eventually ends up on the album. It's either just synth or just piano, and voice. There are a few little producery tricks that happen with some vocal looping, but it is a sparse record. The album kicks off with a real winner, their second single, which was Don't Go. The overwhelming sensation, at least was for me when I first put this record on many, many years ago, was the tidal wave of Alison Moyet's amazing, powerful, androgynous, passionate voice. And the contrast between that and the modernistic, peppy, synthy sound of Vince Clarke's keyboards. An amazing start. Then, however, some of the issues that characterize this album start to appear. A lot of the times the songs are not fully formed. I talked about it being very underproduced. Sometimes that's a good thing. Some of these songs are just crying out for a little bit more. There's just sometimes not enough there, and that's very much the case with the next song, To Pieces. Lyrically, this is a bit impenetrable. I don't know if it's about heartbreak or dementia. It could be either one of the two. But the main issue with the song is that the whole second half is just synthy noodling, and it's just not really enough. I watch a lot of cooking shows. If you're going to cook something simple, you better make it really, really good. This is simple, but not particularly amazing. The third song, Bad Connection, I think it's pretty good, nothing spectacular. Then we're into a kind of a weird, self-indulgent tune, and this, of course, is I before E except after C. This is basically a studio splicing exercise where you've got a vocal track of Alison Moyet and Eric Radcliffe's mother reading out various pieces of an instruction manual. And then slowly you get these synths coming in which are sort of panpipey but sort of farty at the same time. Not really something that you're going to return to. That's followed by Moyes Midnight. This is the other highlighted side one. It's a very personal and emotional lyric by Moyet. It's a great performance. I think it runs out of gas a little bit towards the end, but that's just quibbling. This is a very good song. The final song on side one is In My Room. Again, I think more evidence that they were so rushed getting this record out that they were just filling up space. Lots of vocal overdubs, lots of studio cleverness and trickery, not particularly listenable, not something you're going to go back to. Good news though is that side two is much stronger. It starts off with Only You. I think I said Situation was their best song. I was forgetting about Only You when I said that. This is amazingly beautiful, amazingly moving. And the contrast, again, between that ultra-modern, futuristic synth sound and the raw power of Moyet's voice and the emotion she conveys are just incredible. Next song, Goodbye 70s, got a bit of airplay. It's an interesting song. This is a Moyet composition. It's about her disillusionment with the whole punk scene, dead set against, you know, the fashion police, and we're all about trying to look whatever way you wanted and not being told what to do by the man. It was apparent to Moyet that it had all been a big pose, so she's basically calling out her former punk, now poser, 1980s friends. Musically, I think this is a pretty good song. It's got a strong riff. It's about as close in New Order as Yazoo would ever sound. Situation is next. As I mentioned earlier, I love this song. It's amongst the best 5 synth songs of the whole 1980s, that era which was so dominated by that instrument. It is laden with hooks. There are at least 5 or 6 killer hooks in this song. In terms of the singing, it's a no-holds-barred performance by Moyet. The lyrics also are pleasingly obscure. For the listener, you can basically make the song to be about whatever you want this to be about. I think that's one of the reasons why it was such a great club hit. On the heels of that is Winter Kills, which is a Moyet composition, and she's alone here playing piano. It's actually really refreshing to have a different instrumental sound. As a song, I think a little underdeveloped, but again, her performance is very good. The last song is a fun song called Bring Your Love Down, Didn't I?, which is a song about who has the power in a booty call relationship. Parts of this album are undeniably great. When Moyet is singing and Clarke is finding a way to complement her voice, it's pretty much untouchable as a piece of synth pop. But there are some issues with the album. When Vince is noodling away in his synth for extended periods of time without much product, these 2 songs where there are these snippety, vocal, loopy, studio trickery pieces just feel like this is the band that had to put out a 10-song album and only had 8 songs. There's another issue for the songs which are actually proper songs, which is that these songs were often kind of underdeveloped. The minimalism often works here, but sometimes it doesn't. As a listener, sometimes you're just left wanting more. Moyet's singing is great. The passion she brings through her vocals is intense. Clarke has really come up with a sound which is a distinct sound, and that's a major contribution to music going forward. But you got 3 really good songs here, a couple of other contenders, and about a third of an album which really does not work very well. For me, I give this album 3.5 out of 5 stars.